I'd like at this time to open to the floor for questions. I'm sure lots of you have questions. I better put on my glasses so I can see that far. And you know, you've had a different set of perspectives, from the research to the feds, to a local experience, to the policy side. There's a lot of stuff to take in. But please, in the back.
Interested in your perspective on perspective on your rebuilding, what you're considering with regard to pollution. In Sandy, for example, on the South Shore of Long Island in Westchester County, there was something like 1,000 oil spills, and homes were inundated with sewage from treatment plants that failed, septic systems that failed, and so forth. So as you move forward with creative design, what is being considered in the context of that kind of problem, the cleanup problem after?
Well, the first thing...
And Alex, before you answer, I should have said this, I'm reminded. Could you identify who you are when you ask your question and where you're from?
Larry Swanson, Stony Brook University.
Thank you. Alex.
Well, Larry, the Department of City Planning is doing this open uses study, because a lot of this pollution comes from toxic materials that are stored above ground in the floodplain. And so we've mapped all of those facilities now and are rewriting regulations for their storage to make them, better prepared to, to withstand any potential storm surge. But it's a large issue. It also, with us, involves the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which is a bi-state agency and not under the control specifically of New York City, but between the governors of New Jersey and New York. We talk about this a little bit later, but the issue of environmental law is starting to play a real role here, because there is, our framework is set up to protect nature from our pollution, but now we're needing to protect ourselves. So in a framework where an environmental assessment would ideally return a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact, we have to get a significant impact with every action we take in order to protect ourselves and our potentially dangerous assets to nature. So you see what I mean? We're in this little bit of a catch-22 here, and I'm somewhat worried that environmental law may act as the Achilles heel of some of the adaptation measures we need to take. And your timeline, which showed the enormous space needed for approvals, that's a very vulnerable point for a project. And I'm worried that our time is running out, so that one of the most important things we do is figure out a way of speeding up our decision-making process, in the biggest sense. This is political, legal, financial, and find out a way of making our decisions, our actions, more accurate, quicker, but without sacrificing the public input, which I think is a great strength of our system right now.
I'll just comment on that last point, Alex, that in Hawaii we have done that with permitting, fast-track things, and the pushback from the public is intense.
Yeah.
They hate it because they don't see enough time for their input and their interests within this fast-track, whether it be the zoning, whether it be coastal lands use. And so I think there's a real social political tension, and maybe you and Austin could comment on that.
The key word I think you used is see. See, that was a big part of my job at city planning as chief urban designer. I wowould visualize things that we're expecting. I showed you that there was a kind of that box picture of a building envelope. Well, no layperson can understand what that means if that box were built in their neighborhood. But so I would, and it's got some pictures in the book I can show you later, where I would hand draw over that from a pedestrian perspective to show you, so you can see it, feel it early. And I think social media and computing is advancing to the point where I think something that would have, I could do this in 3 days, now we could do it in 3 seconds. 10 years ago it would take 3 months to make a rendering. So we're getting to a real-time situation where the public can be part of the process more quickly, and which my ideal, my kind of holy grail is to turn EISs, environmental impact statements, from being disclosure documents into being design documents. Can you imagine if everything we learned from doing an EIS were actually used not to say gotcha, but instead to say like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Let's move that wall 5 feet over here, change that piece of infrastructure.
Austin, you want to follow on?
Yeah, I mean, one of the other fundamental shifts that I think needs to happen is that not just the public, but kind of the system of stakeholders around the city or the port or whatever it is that is the item of concern, need to better understand what is at risk for them, but also to better understand what role they can play towards this goal of resilience or adaptation. And you know, that it's not just a question of weighing in on the decision that some other agency is making and making sure that your voice is heard. That's a big part of it, but there's also steps that all of these different stakeholders can take within their own organizations to actually move toward that goal in a more holistic fashion. So in the work that we did in Gulfport and Providence, you know, those stakeholders, when they were thinking about the port and these storm events, they identified something like 128 unique strategies that would build resilience for their whole stakeholder system around the port. And many of those would be up to either the state or federal agencies, and many would be in the kind of implementation domain of the port operator. But there were strategies that every stakeholder group could do towards that common end. So I think that's another part of the puzzle here, is sort of figuring out how to transfer some of the sense of responsibility across that whole stakeholder network, including the public.
Okay, another question. Steve.
Well, I've
in regards to your statements, Austin, with regard to the impacts of, say, a disaster and the negative economic consequences, one of the things from personal experience after Katrina that we observed was there's also a post-disaster explosion of an economy as you have people descending on the area to clean up, to rebuild, to et cetera. And I think, you know, maybe there's some thought that needs to be given to that aspect, how you manage that, because it really taxed the system, it taxed the supply chains. And so there was a lot that happened, and it happened in sort of a haphazard way. And I think trying to, you know, rely on FEMA to manage that whole process is unrealistic. And so you really need to look at partnerships with non-governmental state agencies, as you've, you know, alluded to, and so on.
Yeah, that was a lesson that Gulfport learned, that in the aftermath of Katrina, they had to go through this very elaborate bidding process to get contractors in to do the cleanup. And that's part of the reason, you know, the chickens and pork bellies were still rotting 8 months later. But what they've done now is they've set those contracts up ahead of time, so they have sort of post-storm plans for cleanup contracts. And I think this, you know, shifting to this idea of creating post-storm plans now can help, I mean, take advantage of that economic boom, for one thing, but also really increase the efficiencies.
Alex, quickly.
Quick way, just New York has a slight problem, and obviously is facing this right now, the Build It Back program. Well, if you build things back the way they were, that's actually building it wrong. So that planning has to be to build it back better.
Looking in this side of the room. Yes.
Hi, Monty Graham, University of Southern Mississippi. So kind of following up on where you're going, I appreciate the comments about the ports, but obviously this extends so much beyond the port infrastructure, and it actually brings up this issue of who's managing what infrastructure, who owns what infrastructure, and then how everybody is talking to each other to plan for this, because, you know, ports, airports managed by authorities, then you get into interstate systems that are vulnerable, you know, they're federally operated, and then you get into things like rail systems that are essentially privately managed. So how are we dealing with this sort of disconnect of who's running what and managing what, because we're all vulnerable to the same thing, but we're all so heavily reliant on all of it?
Well, so, I mean, the work that I mentioned, the vulnerability assessment work that we're doing is taking a step towards that more holistic approach, because it brings, I mean, you have in this case it's centered around ports, but all of those other entities are of course stakeholders of the port too. It's a system. And by conducting a process like that, you're bringing those different stakeholders from those different, who represent those different pieces of infrastructure, to the same table so that they can better understand what the challenges are for each other and what the goals and priorities are for each other. So, I mean, that's a step towards that. I mean, I think what you're getting at is just a more holistic process for information sharing and planning.
And Monty, could I direct part of that to Don? I mean, you mentioned working with surrounding communities, and I think that's a really important piece. So how's DoD managing that process? As Monty talks out, you've got different sectors responsible for different pieces. Your success is totally dependent on what some other folks around you do.
There's a number of ways you could speak about it, but we work with local communities in disaster preparing and in communicating with how will we communicate, how will we respond, how can we help. So we often have common structures that can respond to fire, emergencies. DoD will has tremendous amount of assets that they can bring to bear. And on, for instance, in New York City, we had an aircraft carrier moved up to New York quickly to provide flight support for emergency assistance all around. We had Marines on the ground helping with disaster. But we work this through, while we have a lot of the resources, we work this through FEMA, and FEMA working with the community in New York City to bring this to bear. Again, we have resources. The president said we will make these available. We said, what do you need? Water, food, health. And we said we can provide that, and so the services collectively mobilized. The Department of Navy does this not only here but literally worldwide with our hospital ships, with our in Haiti incident. We sat down and we became the way to get goods into the country. The Navy SEALs reestablished a dock provision so you could bring materials in. So we have a lot of capabilities, but it really needs to work very closely through a coordinated, pre-established infrastructure to manage what's going to happen in New York City, and that really is for the federal government, FEMA, with the city.
And you also have nuclear submarines, and it's somewhat apocryphal, but I'm told that Hiniki, which for those of you on the East Coast was the same year as Andrew, when it took out Kauai, I think a nuke got connected up to the grid to provide power, which wasn't a bad deal. Matt, from the federal, well, you've worked both state and policy up here on the Hill. I mean, facing this pushback as areas have regionally, given various stakeholders, to the national ocean policy, to spatial planning, and I mean, what they see as the threat to some of their local control, whether it be fisheries or ports or whatever. I mean, how do you see the path forward to facilitate some of this integration and partnerships, which I think all the sectors here are saying is really, needs to happen?
Sure. Well, I think there are two parts to this. One is, the kind of ongoing, nascent, and implementation of the national ocean policy between the federal agencies trying to stand up some of these regional planning bodies and getting some proof of concept out there that this stuff works. I think is going to be important to get more buy-in. So, there's been a lot of turnover at CQ recently, but hopefully we can get that stabilized soon and get a little bit more, more assertiveness, I guess, from the administration on getting out there with, working that implementation plan. On the flip side, I think it's really important to get local elected officials involved in this. A lot of folks who represent older cities with lots of infrastructure on coasts are engaged. They understand this. I mean, I worked very closely with the mayor of Norfolk, Paul Frame, when I was down there, and he's terrified, and so are city council members, and they're doing what they can to weigh in at the state level and weigh in with their federal representatives. But I don't think there's enough of that, and I think that's a role that folks in here can play. I mean, go to your assemblyman, go to your county commissioner, kind of help them realize that these are important challenges that we're facing, and we can put some pressure on from the bottom up as well through that, and also engagement of stakeholders. For example, the recreational fishing community is one of the kind of sectors that's been a little bit wary of coastal and marine spatial planning, and has been kind of sold a bill of goods about it being ocean zoning and it's going to take away their fishing rights and stuff like that. But that's not the case. It's actually going to help them out in a lot of situations with access to fishing grounds and coordinated use of areas with respect to ocean conflict and stuff. So, engaging stakeholders on that level as well, and feeding information and positive feedback up the chain, I think is going to be important to dealing with some of the the hostility in Congress right now.
Thank you.
I'd like to add Department of Defense, Department of Navy leads for Department of Defense participation in this coastal marine spatial planning effort being led by the CEQ and Office of Science, Technology, and Policy. And I've worked in a state in my previous career. I was director of a state environmental protection agency, and what I've seen, and while I've certainly sensed the tension between various interest groups over this whole idea of doing planning, I think there is a lot of common interest, and we're beginning to have some progress with states that initially came out very opposed to some of this. But and their interest is built around, I'll say, a common set of interest, and that's, in this case, is the concept of resiliency. All of the states involved with marine spatial planning said, well, I don't want the feds telling me what to do, but I, in turn, am going to need to do planning and assessments so that my community, my public, in my state can be protected, can have the emergency resources, and can recover when these hit. And so some of the states that have been reluctant are now coming forward and to work more collaboratively in this marine spatial planning. Not about who can fish here, but about how do I recognize this challenge that we all face. And so while it's slow, it doesn't happen at the pace that members of Congress, sometimes administrations often say we need to do this. We got 3 years to do it. It sometimes takes 3 years to process the idea. This is a good idea. We ought to do this. But if you can engage all of the stakeholders, I think we still have a way forward. And the Department of Navy is actually the lead for 2 of the planning areas, and is just now getting the states to step forward and say, maybe we should be doing this. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed, but encouraged.
There's a microphone with a question over there.
Will Knuckles from W.H. Knuckles Consulting here in D.C. A question for Don, following up on your comments about the importance of being able to plan with communities. I was wondering if you've seen any patterns that you can tell us about as it relates to, particularly at levels below the state level, when we're talking about cities and counties. Are you seeing regional differences? Are you seeing differences that relate to how much money a particular region has? And I'm talking about domestically in that respect. And then can you talk about community planning in the U.S. Where your off-base assets are in relation to what you're seeing OCONUS offshore?
you see the full gamut of interest, as you see, represents the full gamut of opinions that the public has across this country. So some are very interested in planning, and some are not. But I think even those that are very concerned about, as I mentioned, the federal engagement, concerning about if it means federal directives, we're bringing them all because whether they think the federal government should lead, they certainly recognize that we have some common issues that we need to jointly address. As far as overseas, we equally see a variety of opinions. Some organizations, some communities, some states, some countries are very want to get out and do it collectively. But I certainly see that after storm events, after disasters happen, folks go, you know, we might actually want to work with you because actually we, Department of Navy, has a lot of assets, and we can provide real help in emergencies, in follow-up, in support, and that's one of our missions, and that builds trust when after and related to those events.
So we have some pent-up questions. We're going to turn over to this sector. Sir.
Hi, I'm Jim Etzen. I'm from the University of Connecticut.
Thank you.
This is a great panel discussion. I'm already thinking about getting Alex and Austin to come give talks. But this is again for Don. I was thinking, we're actually, our campus is at the mouth of the Thames River. And just upriver from us is Electric Boat and General Dynamics. And just up from them is the subbase on the Thames River. So I consider this is a good thing for our region. I consider us a stakeholder in this case. However, looking at your presentation, it seemed like you had to have a certain security clearance to get involved in some of these studies. I was wondering, is there a role in this for academic institutions like UConn that would be very interested in seeing that base survive a storm?
Absolutely. The interesting part about that is this planning is not a security issue. Certainly, as the department, as the federal agency put together a national security strategy, there is lots of information that may be classified. But with respect to how do we respond to storms, how we interact with the community, that absolutely revolves stakeholders. For Department of Defense, under the research program known as CERTIP, those dollars, they put out offers to communities, research institutes, universities, saying, we want to study these areas. And I know they've recently had proposals out for the major geographic regions around the United States to look at what would be the tools that would be appropriate to use in these areas to address sea level rise and storm issues. And so that is right along the line with the aspect, and certainly I'm not personally familiar with what's being done at the subbase to working with those communities, but I know from a Department of Defense and a Department of Navy, the subbase needs to be assessed. It's on the list to do work, and the university would be a great team member in that assessment.
Sure. It's Marlon Lewis from Dalhousie University in Halifax. So a question directed, I guess, initially at Mr. Schreierdis, but it's a little bit more general there. Your focus, as the other speakers, has been on the United States installations, largely in operations in the United States, but the Navy, more so than any others, certainly operates globally, and climate change will have impact on your operations in Yokosuka, Diego Garcia, Halifax, for example, and others. Perhaps, so I'm interested in trying to understand a little bit more about your efforts to try to assess vulnerabilities and opportunities internationally. More generally, and this is perhaps to the broader audience, one of the speakers mentioned that 80% of our goods coming into the United States arise from overseas operations, and so we don't necessarily just need to be concerned about U.S. ports, we need to be as concerned about the ports of origin for many of those services, because as we saw in the tsunami, we had a severe disruption to our supply chain for many of our industries when we're no longer able to get goods out of Japan. So a little bit long-winded, but over to you, sir.
I spent a little more time talking about the U.S. because we have more, we can manage that more directly. We have control, we have responsibility, we own the bases. A lot of our overseas, those are actually installations, facilities that are owned and either leased or provided with some type of a international agreement between the United States and the foreign country. And so we are often guests, if you will, on identified facilities. We make common investments in those installations that are required sometimes by the United States, and we pay for them, and other times by the host nation. We've worked very closely with Japan and certainly have key assets in Japan. And the President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense have all been in close discussions with Japan throughout their disasters and how we can support and how we can recover from the tsunami and earthquakes there. So that's a joint issue. We certainly do planning, but that we a lot of times require decision. We gather data and provide information. We provide needs, and the host country then works with us in setting, determining, putting the priorities together for follow-up constructions and needs.
Austin wants to follow, then I'll take a question from Don.
I mentioned quickly this expert group of planners, engineers, port operators. That was convened by the UN Conference on Trade and Development. It's a group that's been meeting annually for the past 5 or 6 years, to pay special attention to the situation of ports in developing nations and the role that they play both in their own local economies, but also the role that those ports play in the global supply chains. And so the purpose of this expert group has been to really look at this problem and to try to identify ways that that assistance can be offered to ports in developing nations to develop resilience and adaptation strategies. And I'm happy to talk to you about it more later if you're interested in that effort.
Don and
Great. Don Bosch, University of Maryland. I'd like to, it was a great discussion, but these are solvable issues. I'd like to shift the discussion a little bit to a really hard question, hard issue. Austin had it in the slide, but he didn't say much about it, and this is the R word, relocate. And there's a little bit of addressing the issue. Alex talked about build it back, but then he said better. He didn't say maybe not build it back. And Matt talked about the bigger waters pushback on flood insurance, which is basically saying that we're going to allow people to insure people who live in areas that are fundamentally uninsurable. So how do we address this? And particularly, you have a room full of people who are leaders in education at American universities, and we should be out in front and educating the broader public, who are the real people who, of course, have to pay the bill, have the impact of these kinds of decisions. How do we educate the broader American public to the challenges that we have before us, which are really, in this sense, especially with respect to sea level rise, are unprecedented in our experience and are going to be enormous in the scale if we're talking about 1 meter or 2 meters? How do we get people to think about approaching this issue of relocation when every time we've confronted it, after Katrina, presently in Detroit, we're trying to shrink the footprint of where no one wants to leave.
It's complex. I'll begin first by saying that cities don't like to cut and run. They stay put. Constantinople didn't get up and move when marauding bands of vandals came. They built a wall, and they built it. The Theodosian Wall was big enough so that the city could actually grow within it. So it, again, solved the technical problems of those marauding vandals, but let the city grow and improve. Fort Defiance Bar I mentioned in Red Hook, Well, that's named after a little fort that stayed and fought when George Washington's army was retreating. Maybe the reason we have a United States is because somebody didn't move. So there's a lot of emotion about staying where you are. So that's just a British. That's just a British. This is a global invasion of H2O molecules. But so, and I'm often told, even Klaus Jacobs tells me, "Hey, Alex, why don't you move? Why are you living in Red Hook on the water?" But no, people don't want to move. But I think there is a solution to it, and it relates a lot to very neighborhood-specific solutions. First of all, we have tried buying people out. Staten Island, New Jersey has a program. That can only work for a minuscule amount of the population, the buildings, and we kid ourselves to think that we can solve the problem by, no city is rich. Abu Dhabi could not do this. So what we find is that you have to do a limited amount of public investment that triggers a much greater volume of private investment in adaptation. Now that adaptation, it's counterintuitive, but you could actually have more people living, say, on Coney Island, right in the path storm, if they're living in a 20-story concrete frame high-rise designed to withstand hurricane. Our wind loads are already very high, our codes. That is a resilient building. A bungalow in the Rockaways is not a resilient building. And if you build that bungalow back just the way it was, hey, you haven't accomplished a thing in terms of resilience. But if you, let's say, rezone, change the density of the area, if you have demand, you can go to a typology that is actually much more resilient. So we're trying different solutions, even for lower Manhattan, which Wall Street should move, typically, given the ecological pressures on it. But we're looking at solutions like maybe building an offshore berm wall that can take some more development. I see when I see relocation, planners think of it in 2 dimensions: move away. I think of it in 3 as an architect: move up. But at the same time, do it in a way that you maintain the richness of your streets and the life in your public spaces. So it's a hard problem, but it's not insoluble.
Austin.
So this is an area that we're starting to look at URI, and we are convening a group of engineers, landscape architects, policymakers, scientists, and designers and artists to start conceptualizing what we're calling coastal undevelopment. And the idea is to start wrapping our minds around we're not going to be able to, ultimately, we can't afford to protect even every urban coastal community. We're just not going to be able to do it, when we start getting out towards the end of the century and beyond. But we don't know what this means. It's a very complicated problem. I think it's really critical to bring in the artist and designer perspective as we're trying to kind of frame out even what the questions are. So that's a first step. What are the questions? What happens to the infrastructure that's left behind? Where do people go? How long does it take? Is it a phased approach? Do we just wait for a storm to come and then do it? But at some point, this is going to be a reality, and I think looking at it in a conceptual way now can bring attention to the gravity of the problem and can inspire people towards taking some more adaptation steps. But it can also start to get people used to the idea that moving forward, we're looking at some pretty big changes.
So the other R word is retreat, right? And it's not only backwards, but as Alex says, it's upwards.
Retreat implies an incremental move back, and I don't know that that's what we're going to be. Some places may do that, other places may split.
So for
entirely.
a lot of coastal states, and certainly Hawaii, if tourism is one of the biggest industries there is, and if you're defining your coastal experience as sandy beaches and offshore stuff, and the way many of you who came out to the Ocean Sciences meeting 10 days ago saw, the future of that, let's say Waikiki, that may look a lot different in 50 years than it does now. And it may be that you have still a coastal experience with this high-rise sort of scenario with as already exists in many of the resorts, with swimming pools that have a view of the ocean, but that are elevated and yes, you can get down to a beach, but it may not be the beach experience right there that you've thought about historically. There will be other places that will have beaches in our state, but they may not be the same places as before. So there's some very different thinking about how you visualize. And I love the artist. My wife's an artist. You've got to get the artists involved. How you think and vision that future. Don, you wanted to say something too.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention down in Pensacola, Florida, the naval base there was hit by a hurricane here a few years ago, and in the reconstruction, rebuild afterwards, we had strong public pressure by historic preservation interests to maintain, preserve, rebuild called Admiral Row. It was a series of old homes that were down on the waterfront. The Navy tried very hard, and were eventually successful. And they said, well, you got to leave the Admiral's homes. Well, in the end, to settle the suit, we left the storm-damaged Admiral's homes on a portion of the beach, and we're still trying to decide what actually to do with those storm-damaged homes. We took the buildings, we took the offices, we took them off, but there's such a strong. We were going to pay. We'll put our Admirals out. Our Admirals aren't living in these beat-up, flooded-out homes for the last year, but they wanted to save the homes. So it's really an interesting thing with the public. Really was insisting that you carry out.
Yeah. Susan, did you still have a question? No, that's okay. Okay, and this young lady over here has been adamant that she needs to pose a question, so.
Well, the advantage of waiting is that I thought of another comment I want to make, and that. So I have a question for Alex, but the comment I want to make is that I'm an economist. I'm Margaret Walls at Resources for the Future, and I haven't heard enough about economics and the role that it plays, and especially came to mind just a minute ago when Austin talked about all the people at the University of Rhode Island that are working on this new coastal undevelopment. And
there's the economists too.
Okay, because there's a lot of issues here with incentives and that we need to talk about. But my question for Alex is I just would like you to expound a little bit more on the point you made about we know how to change buildings, we know what we need to do, and we're bumping up against all of these regulatory barriers. You started to say a little bit, but could you just talk a little bit more about those problems?
Sure, I'd be happy to. In fact, I'll use my house again as the paradigm here. I gave you the landscape, the current regulatory landscapes that's pushing me towards a garage. I don't want to do that. I want to have a cafe or a restaurant on my ground floor opening out onto the street. Cafes need basements to store and restaurants need basements to store their food. So the building department will allow me a basement, but only if I flood-proof it. Okay, so by flood-proofing the basement, I've now created about 12 feet of head between the FRCE, the flood resilient construction elevation, which is the height I have to flood-proof to, which is about 4 feet above the sidewalk. Not impossible, but by including the basement, now I've got about 12 feet. So I've built a boat, a very dangerous concrete boat that will rise with stormwater rising. And so how do I counter that? So I went to all my engineering friends, and we had a lot of fun figuring out these things, hydrostatic diverters, sort of like organ pipes that could use French drain tiles underneath my foundations and shoot the water out the front, as it pushes up. But that wouldn't handle enough of the pressure. So then we said, well, all right, let's use gravity to handle the pressure, and we'll just make the basement slab so deep, so thick that it'll weigh so much that it'll push against the water and not move. So we calculated that, and it would have to be 5 feet deep, which is great. I just have to pay for more concrete, but it would be so heavy that it would collapse my soil, so my house would fall in and all my neighbors as well. So then they came up with this idea. All right, well, we've done this in Dubai. Let's strengthen the soil, right? Because you're on sand. It's Red Oak. It's a beachy place. So we can inject grout into the soil. That will strengthen the soil. You can then put the heavier slab on it, and then everything will be fine. So right now I'm in that kind of trying to balance these three very difficult engineering things, when the simplest thing to do would be to let my basement flood. We'll just buy more bananas later, right? So it would act as ballast against the hydrostatic uplift. But the building code won't let me do that. The NFIP won't let me do that. And somehow we have to get people aware of these circumstances and change some of the regulation.
Okay, I'm going to have one
If I could just address
comment
that
from Matt,
real
and
quickly.
then one last question from Rob.
I was glad that you mentioned incentives, because that's, the perverse incentives that are related to some of these government programs are really kind of shocking, and that was one of the disappointing things for me personally, at least. I'm not going to speak for my member on this, but with the debate and the action on kind of rolling back some of these flood insurance reforms, and on the economic front, I think, as you continue to let people rebuild repetitive loss properties without some of the safeguards that Alex was talking about, you may reach a tipping point economically for some localities. I mean, it's not going to happen in New York because you have enough resources, but elsewhere, if a government has to continue to provide services, provide transportation and utilities and emergency services to neighborhoods or communities that continue to rebuild in places that they shouldn't, it's going to be a big drain on municipal resources, which are limited and have a lot of other challenges. So one of the laws that's actually under the jurisdiction of our committee is the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, which is a really ingenious law, actually, and it was passed in the early 1980s, a lot of bipartisan support, and it basically says if you live in the Coastal Barrier Resources System, which is basically lines drawn on a map around barrier islands and some areas right on shore, then you can build there, and if your property gets flooded, you can rebuild there, do whatever you want. But you can't get federal flood insurance, you can't get federal transportation subsidies, or any of that kind of thing. So it's kind of a market-based approach, but it's something that I think has proven in a number of cases to limit haphazard coastal development. And now with sea level rise, maybe we need to look at what is a coastal barrier now and what needs to be afforded a higher level of scrutiny. I mean, we're not just talking about barrier islands. Maybe we're talking about riparian areas and coastal wetlands and stuff like that we need to think about limiting some of these government subsidies to.
Last question from Rob.
Yeah, Rob Dunbar, Stanford University. Great panel and great moderation, Brian. Just a quick comment and then a question about the Defense Department. Sure. So the comment comes from the work that's been done in the Netherlands. They've had the Delta Commission and nationwide planning efforts underway for some time now. And there are maps out there that show, okay, here's the part that we're giving back to the sea, right? Massive relocation. Maybe it's 20% of the nation. And then here are the parts we're going to protect, and different strategies for that. And I think one of the keys there is that it's been out there for public comment for a long time, and it just gives people a chance to really think potentially decades in advance that they will be doing some substantial relocation. And I suspect there's some lessons to be learned there. But here's the question. I'm fascinated by, the Defense Department studies related to climate change. And it sounds like it's mainly adaptation and planning for adaptation, which what else can you do right now? But, it's going to cost a ton of money. And does that information feed up into Congress and the Senate, the cost of climate change just to maintain our national security? And does it have an impact on some of the naysayers? And then the counterpart to that is, are some of our elected leaders pushing back on Defense Department acceptance of the likelihood of some of these climate change impacts?
I believe that as we do our planning and we look at longer periods like the quadrennial review, and we always have a 5-year budget estimate that we're looking out, which is long for even the annual budget process that we go through. The Department of Defense, for its weapon systems, generally looks 20, 30, 40 years, recognizing the time to develop, manufacture, implement. So we do have a longer planning horizon that we try to understand what are the needs and the changes. Congress has been supportive. They understand that, but it's you say, do we get pushback? We constantly get pushback, and you get pushback about, well, that may be what you think you want to do, Department of Defense, but I want to still build these airplanes. My community relies on this ship, this location. I think the Defense Department really does a pretty good job of laying out for leadership within an administration, and then with Congress, to the extent that we're allowed to, what are challenges, our desires and needs. But it's Congress and the people that say, well, wait a minute, that may be what you want to do, but that's we're going to have to modify that to meet the collective needs of the public, and that's what Congress does. And some of those are difficult for our thoughtful leaders to try to, wait a minute, I really don't need that. I really can't be here. And they say, no, you're going to be here, or you're gonna have these. And so we work with that. But generally, we are clearly looking ahead. We try to look at a time horizon about what are we gonna see in 10 years? What do we see in 20 years? How are our tactics, strategies, systems going to support what we anticipate in the future, not just what we need today, next year. And so I think that gives us a horizon, and that information is certainly shared with the Armed Services Committee, with Congress. The dollars are that is a real interesting thing about how those play out. But that's, anyway, so we do have information, we share it, there's discussions and debates on it, and Congress and its wisdom, issues budgets and directives and laws.
Okay, so as promised, we had lots of time for a great Q&A session. Thank you all for participating, and thank the panel for their excellent job.